For 30 years in United States politics, North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms set the bar for this country's social conservatism. Helms was unabashed in his opposition to civil rights, gay rights, disability rights, environmentalism, feminism, affirmative action, and access to abortion. Today, one of his granddaughters lives in Asheville and is doing what she can to rebuke his legacy.
I think it's deeply powerful and meaningful to be the holder of the counter narrative in a family and also the counter voice in the family. And it's okay to say, I am not okay with this transmitting down my lineage, and I'm going to use my voice as a Helms to say, no, this one ends with us.
I'm Matt Peiken. My guest today is Gaddy. She's using the Helms lineage as a pulpit to fight for causes her grandfather opposed, chiefly women's bodily autonomy and their access to abortion. We'll talk with her about growing up under the spectre of Jesse Helms' rhetoric and touch on the price she has paid within her family for speaking against the late senator's views. They say to never buy a used car without really looking under the hood. Jennifer Thomas says the same goes for real estate. Jennifer is a licensed geologist in Asheville who thrives on digging up the dirt. If you're investing in commercial property, call Jennifer first. She'll conduct Phase 1 environmental assessments, investigate the ground for contamination, and oversee any necessary cleanup. For details on what Jennifer brings to the table and to the land, go to gentechllc.com. That's GENNTECLLC.com. I began my conversation with Gaddy by asking how much she was aware of while growing up about Jesse Helms' stature in U.S. politics and the positions he staked.
Oh, we were very much aware that our grandfather was a United States Senator. Depending on your birth year, some of us were on the political stage, like election night as infants. I mean, we spent our entire childhood, adolescence, like campaigning, going to political events. There was never a moment in my life when I wasn't aware of who he was. In fact, when I was about 4 years old and a friend was driving me to preschool, a friend's mom, she saw me look at political signs for my grandfather's opponent, and I saw them, and I said, those people hate me. And I was like 4 years old, and so from a very young age, it was this awareness of this person who was very polarized, and some people really liked him, and some people really did not, and this understanding that it was deeply personal.
You have no outside vantage of this, but what must have been very striking and stamping to you as a person, even at such a young age, that there were people for and against other people, that you had people who were against your grandfather, and I guess by extension against your family.
Yes.
Did you feel that in a real way, even among your friends and people you knew, that you and your family were different, were seen in a certain light that others your age weren't?
Yes, absolutely. Growing up, I would say I was very aware of friends whose parents voted for my grandfather and friends whose parents did not vote for my grandfather. And it's just very visceral, you could tell.
What was your relationship like with your grandfather when you were young?
Growing up, I would say probably the most wonderful thing about it was that politics has always been deeply personal and real. We grew up going to DC all the time. And so it made it like very accessible. There used to be this little trolley that connected like the Senate office buildings to the Capitol building. So when we were all really little, we got to drive that with the conductor who like shuttled politicians to and from the Capitol to their offices, and just little things like that all along the way that made it so real and so personal and so accessible.
You make that out to be a positive, that politics was real. And for a kid, I would think, wouldn't prototypical childhood would be devoid of politics? You would play, you would just find yourself in the world and socially, but you never could do that outside the realm of politics, nor does it sound like you wanted to. You really, at least at that age, you embraced that sort of, and for lack of a better word, privilege to have that kind of access and that reality, as you said, with politics.
That's all I knew. It was always so real and so in our face, and we were always such a part of it. My grandfather was the traditional family values politician, one of the original, and we were the traditional family values one-trick pony. We were always up there with him. Like, we were always there for it.
When did you start having the first inklings of a mind of your own around politics and issues and things that, whether your grandfather stood for them or just other things that were in the vapor around politics? And I imagine you were growing up in the 70s and 80s, correct? In the
80s and 90s.
80s and 90s. So what were the issues of the time? And tell me, what was the doctrinaire thinking in your family and your grandfather's thinking, and when did you start having your own feelings around certain issues?
Sure. Well, probably a big one that really stood out for me was, of course, HIV, AIDS. And he very much in the beginning saw that as a homosexual disease. And he was very anti-homosexuality because of his religious beliefs and very outspoken about that. And then I remember growing up and seeing Ryan White and remembering that he had gotten HIV through the blood transfusion, and just, seeing this kid and then seeing what my grandfather was saying about HIV AIDS. And that was like a moment where it was like, something doesn't feel right here. And that was one of the issues that over time he also came to change his mind about, with the help of Bono, actually, U2's Bono, who really reached out to him and was like, as a Christian, like, you have to take care of everybody and look out for all people who are suffering from this illness, and really changed his mind on that. But in the 80s, that was probably 80s and 90s, that was one of those issues where it was like, okay, this doesn't feel okay at all.
How old were you when you started thinking that?
Oh my goodness. How old was I then? Was that 10? I'm not sure.
That young, that's pretty young to even be aware of who homosexual people were.
I don't even know that I knew what that meant at that age. I just knew my grandfather didn't like that. Yeah.
Your grandfather's legacy is stamped, at least in large part, by segregationism and race relations. Just give me a sense of your awareness of race in the shadow of your grandfather's legacy with race.
Oh, it was very painful because along the way he would make statements which I can't even draw at this point. And it was clear that it was hurtful to people around me. But at the time, he said whatever he wanted to say. He was always like in the news for statements that were deeply painful.
How did this affect you when you became at least of an age? And that's what I guess I was getting at. At what age do you become aware, oh, this is hurtful. This isn't the, quote, the truth, or this isn't the universal truth. Everybody has their own value systems and ethics. When did you start to have an independent sense away from your grandfather? And when you did, what did you do? What did you start thinking?
Sure. I get asked this a lot. Everyone wants there to be this like one moment where, everything cracks open and you change your whole belief system. And it's really not like that. I would say it was little moments along the way, because I was so immersed in his worldview and campaigning and doing all the things with him. But there are all these moments along the way, especially like Ryan White and the HIV AIDS, where it just did not feel right. And so I would say like the dominoes were all lined up. And then when I went away to college, I was studying geology, I was in the sciences, and I was taking a science class, and just the whole thing like busted open, that the world is so much bigger than the worldview that I grew up in, and that just all the dominoes fell.
Yeah. Where did you go to school?
I started at App State in environmental geology, which is a little bit funny because I was on track to become probably an oil and gas lobbyist in DC. Like my last trip to DC, I had dinner or lunch with my grandfather in the Senate dining room with an executive from, I believe it was Exxon. And so that lobbying path was lined up if I had wanted it. And then I went through the dominoes falling, and I'm like, okay, I know I don't believe any of this, and I've got to figure out what I do believe. And so that's when I left the South, and I moved out west.
Where'd you move?
To Boulder first, and then Seattle shortly thereafter.
Two very, at least historically, bastions of liberal
Rebellion,
liberal ideology.
Yes.
So were these moves difficult within your family in your direction?
No, not at first. it was okay to have different beliefs.
That's interesting, actually, right? Because
Yeah.
your grandfather is at least known for, of his era, an extremist ideology and hearkening back to pre-civil rights and pre-women's rights. His legacy is firmly stamped in that, where I guess a lot of people who may not know better wouldn't have thought he had moved at all, let alone, you mentioned Bono having an influence on him around AIDS. And I'm wondering, within your family, was this sort of ideology almost like religion? Like, we can't question, this is how we think.
Yes, very much so. And so when I say that some family members knew that I was questioning and changing my beliefs, it wasn't him. Like, he was in DC. And also, by the time I did move away, he was aging at that point.
So how did you muster the wherewithal, or was it difficult to muster the wherewithal to move in a direction that at least others in your family, whether siblings, parents, extended family, weren't?
I'm deeply curious. And so once the dominoes had fallen, I just wanted to explore what was out there in terms of liberal thought. And I just really embraced it. So it was not scary for me at all. It was, this is new and this is exciting. And I love ideas and theory and anything that opposed or cast light on what I grew up in. I had to get out of it to be able to look back at it. And by the time I got to Seattle, I enrolled at Antioch University, Seattle. It was downtown. And the whole pedagogy was focused on transformative adult learning. So it was adults from all over the country, all walks of life, coming together to complete their undergraduate degree together. And they all knew who I was, and they all knew the background that I came from. And all the teachers, all my teachers and mentors there knew. And it was this incredibly supportive and safe environment to begin to unpack the worldview and belief system of my birth, and to begin to interrogate it, to reconcile it, to understand, what do I want to do to help transform this?
There's two things I want to follow on that. One of which you said others at the university, there's faculty, other students, they knew, everyone knew.
Yeah.
And there was a support system. You easily could have not talked about that, I imagine. You're a granddaughter. At the time, did you have the last name Helms?
I had the middle name Helms. I never had the last name Helms.
That was your middle name?
Yeah, Ellen Helms.
Ellen Helms, that's interesting. So, but you could have shielded yourself from that to some degree, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like you were very open about that, willingly open about it. Why? A lot of people, I'm not saying you shouldn't have been, but a lot of people, whatever their pasts are that they might be embarrassed about, through no fault of their own, they want to distance themselves from, stamp their own identity and not be associated with somebody in their family who has committed or said certain things that oppose their value system. You didn't distance yourself. Why not?
I think this goes back to I didn't have a childhood like other people. I've always been immersed in politics. And so this was just an extension of that. Okay, this is what I was born into. This is all that I know. So now now that I'm out of it, look back on it to figure it out and understand it better and understand it from different perspectives.
Matt Peiken here from The Overlook. I'll be back to my conversation in just a moment, but I'm asking you, the listener, yes, you listening this very moment, is The Overlook making a difference in your connection to Asheville? Do you know more about what makes this city tick and where we're struggling? Let me ask, if you had to give up 1 cup of coffee every month to do your part to keep this show going, would you step up? If you answered yes to any of that, and I really hope you did, please support The Overlook by giving just $5 a month. Your support keeps this show free for anyone to hear. Go to patreon.com/The Overlook Podcast. Supporters get free tickets to my first live podcasting events, and I have some very cool items that come at higher levels of giving. Your support means the world to me. Go to patreon.com/The Overlook Podcast. You'll also find a link in all our social channels. I began the second half of my conversation with Ellen Gaddy by asking how her legacy and name shaped the direction she wanted to take in her own life.
That's a good question. So I completed my undergraduate degree at Antioch University, and then I went on to receive my master's and PhD from Saybrook University in psychology, but I studied liberation psychology.
I don't think I know liberation psychology. Can you describe that field?
Sure. Are you familiar with liberation theology
No.
and Catholicism?
Okay, but I just haven't heard the liberation prefix to that. Yeah.
Yeah, liberation psychology derives from liberation theology. In Latin America, during the Dirty Wars down there, some Jesuit priests were really looking, liberation theologists were really starting to interrogate the Catholic Church for its role in colonialism, and which typically served colonizers and not the oppressed. And so liberation theology really started to see God through the eyes of the people and how can we help the oppressed and not oppressors. And so it was a huge reimagining of Catholicism through liberation theology. So then liberation psychology is a similar thing in that it looks to decolonize psychology and look at psychology through the eyes of the oppressed. So the basic premise of liberation psychology is that as long as my privilege in the world affects somebody else's and causes somebody else's oppression, I cannot ever be truly healed or reconciled, and that therefore my process of healing is linked to the process of healing of others who are harmed by my role and my position of privilege. And so liberation psychology, as I was learning about it and understanding, using it as a tool to look at my grandfather's legacy and reconcile it, I discovered that he was involved in political terror in Latin America during the Dirty Wars. And he was actually political allies and associates with one of the death squad commanders who they think was responsible for the assassination of the founder of liberation psychology. And so here I am, working on my PhD at this point, and I've discovered this process of healing that is deeply meaningful for me, and I'm using it to reconcile the legacy that the political legacy that I've created, and then find out that my grandfather was involved in the historical circumstances of the assassination of the founder, and it was absolutely gutting. I remember the day that I was reading liberation psychology. I was immersed in it, and I was reading. It was in El Salvador, and it just started. I felt it. I knew that my grandfather had been involved there, and so I started Googling, and sure enough, it came up.
You were already pursuing this. You'd be driven to study this, then to have this deep polar opposite connection in terms of what your grandfather's connection to this was. How did that shape or fuel what you wanted to do in this field?
At that point, once I found that out, I'm I'm all in. And I had to decide where I felt like I personally, as a woman, had the most power to push back on his legacy. And since the dominoes fell and I had my awakening, I've always been pro-choice, supported women's rights, and I understood that my grandfather had what's called the Helms Amendment. And the Helms Amendment restricts USAID funding from funding abortions globally. And it's 50 years old this year. And each and every year, roughly 37 million women globally have unsafe abortions. About 19 million of those are in countries that receive USAID funding for healthcare. And so when we think about liberation psychology and my process of healing being tied to other women in the world who have been harmed by my grandfather's legacy, I cannot be truly liberated. I cannot be truly healed. I cannot truly reconcile this legacy unless I can help push back and help those women who are harmed by the Helms Amendment every year.
You mentioned about abortion rights. What other areas have you taken a deeply personal interest in working on?
I would say, if you look at my grandfather was so polarizing that there's so many places where I could have plugged in.
Right.
And I cannot take on all of those. That's too much to ask of anybody. And so part of going through the master's and PhD process was to get the lay of the land, to understand his legacy, and then to really sit with myself and be like, where can I be the most impactful? Because no one can take on the whole thing. It's too much.
Right.
It's not my job, and it's not healthy to do that. But I knew I could take on part of it. And as a woman, that's what I knew I could take on.
So tell me, how have you defined the work you can take on and want to take on?
I am extremely justice-oriented. All women have to have the right to bodily autonomy, to control their bodies, to be able to determine their economic trajectory. And just the idea that my grandfather, who was here in North Carolina, is determining the Helms Amendment, through the Helms Amendment, is determining that for women thousands of miles from here is not okay. Women whose lives and circumstances we do not know anything about, and who have grown up in countries that do not have the resources that we do. And the fact that the Helms Amendment restricts what these women, options for these women and how they determine their trajectory, it was just unjust. It's not okay. And so that was a place where I'm like, okay, I have to help here.
You're being very clear. The things you stand for are in direct opposition to what your grandfather's legacy was, at least in the Senate. And at the same time, you have a certain voice in this fight because of your grandfather. I think that's an interesting polarity. And I'm wondering how having the Helms legacy, how do you think that enhances your voice or gives you a certain fuel in your drive, your ethical and moral drive that you might not have without that legacy?
Yeah, of course, because a Helms pushing back on a Helms I think it's powerful. But I will say that I took years to make sure I had command of my voice and that I knew from where I was speaking. Yeah, I think it's deeply powerful and meaningful to be the holder of the counter narrative in a family and also the counter voice in the family. And it's okay for families who have legacies that have issues that need to be reconciled and healed. It's okay to say, I am not okay with the Helms Amendment or whatever the issue is. I am not okay with this transmitting down my lineage. And I'm going to use my voice as a Helms to say, no, this one ends with us. This one ends with me.
I know you've done some writing on this. You wrote a piece I read through Politico that was, I guess, addressed to President Biden. And you've met the president more than once,
yes.
Right? So in what ways is your voice taking shape now and going forward?
I was hopeful that I was going to be able to work on the Helms Amendment with Hillary Clinton. Hillary had said that she would reinterpret the Helms Amendment, and then, of course, was not elected. And that was very devastating to me. And so for a while, I didn't know that I would have the opportunity to push back. And then when President Biden was elected, it was like, wait a minute, I know you. I've met you many times. You were at my grandfather's funeral. He was literally one of the only Democratic senators who would come over and say hello to us when we were in D.C. I remember being around a lot of others, but he and my grandfather had a very interesting and beneficial working relationship across the aisle. And so when he was elected, it was this moment of, okay, now is the chance where I can say, hey, I've met you. I know you. We've met before. I don't know you well. We've met. Please look at this. Please consider reinterpreting this amendment. And Biden is not able to repeal it himself, but if the Helms Amendment were reinterpreted, then U.S. aid funding could go to support abortion care in the case of rape, incest, and threat to the mother's life, and also maybe in conflict zones. For example, in Ukraine right now, none of the aid that we've sent to Ukraine could go to women who have been raped by Russian soldiers who are seeking abortion care. And so this moment now, I was supported in writing I wrote the op-ed, but I was supported in that by IPAS, who is a global health group. They formed 50 years ago in response to the Helms Amendment. They've helped support and provide contraceptives and abortion care in Africa, Latin America, and Asia for 50 years. And they've also been, in the past few years, really looking at the repeal of the Helms Amendment. And I've worked with IPAS for the past 10 years, both as a funder of abortions globally, but also behind the scenes connecting with other abortion funders. And so I've had this really organic process with IPAS. They've been very supportive. And during COVID, IPAS was like, we've known you for a long time. You've been working with us behind the scenes. Are you ready to step forward and be the voice for the repeal of the Helms Amendment? And that was during COVID, and Donald Trump was still president. And I was like, oh, I don't know. I don't think it's like safe or wise, or I don't think now is the time. And then as soon as he lost the election and Biden was elected, like we revisited and it was like, okay, yes, now's the time. Now seems like the right moment for me to step forward.
What do you do with your time in Asheville when you're not fighting for women's rights and abortion access? Are there other things, other issues, other things that you're taking on, other work that you take on?
Yes, I am a philanthropist, so I support a whole bunch of organizations in town and have for a long time. I'm on the board of Our Voice, which is a sexual assault, rape crisis, human trafficking organization here in town. So I work a lot with Our Voice. Also, I'm deeply committed to helping with the problem of homelessness here in Asheville, which is such a huge issue.
In what area, what are you working on specifically around helping homelessness?
The Home is Key initiative on Tunnel Road, which is the permanent housing location.
Is that the converted hotel?
Yes, it's the converted hotel, and we're working to support the medical clinic there. So just trying to do whatever I can through philanthropy to help as many orgs in town. But Homeward Bound, homelessness, and then Our Voice are two huge areas of focus.
You're still in your prime and young in this work. I'm wondering, have you considered or been approached about going into politics yourself? I'm sure you've been asked that before.
I've been asked that so many times, and I don't think so. Not at this time.
And I asked this because, I'm not saying you should. You were raised in the environment. None of it seems like it would faze you in a certain way. You're very public about your history or your legacy. At least you seem to have an unwavering voice about the issues that matter to you. And also we're in a generation when we're looking for younger leaders to step up and help carry a Democratic/liberal progressive party forward. You just seem to be in a prime sort of position internally and externally to wage that kind of life if you wanted to. I'm curious why you wouldn't want to.
Probably because I grew up in it. And so I know what it's like behind the scenes. It's hard growing up in the public light, in the limelight. You always have to be on point. It's hard on family. And so I've always thought of myself more as the political activist. And through that, I am very much a politician without having to be a politician. So I definitely wear my political hat and always will. But honestly, I've not thought about running for public office.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's the next pitched battle or the next pitched cause that we can see you on the front lines on?
So the Helms Amendment is not going away. I'm going to be working on that for a long time. I also am connected with Planned Parenthood South Atlantic. And as I'm sure you're aware, North Carolina has picked up probably 37% of cases since Dobbs and since Roe fell. And so we have to fight to keep abortion safe and legal here in North Carolina. And right now it is, and that's probably an area of focus that I will also be committed to going forward, as well as working with Red, Wine, and Blue, working to help galvanize and harness the suburban women vote for repro justice. A lot of these women have not been political, and even though they are pro-choice and they are for repro justice and freedom, they haven't gone through that process of being really ready to be like, I am pro-choice and I'm going to vote on this issue. And so really it's looking at helping women make that first step into being political and being okay and feeling safe to do so and feeling like they're part of a community of women who are supportive of this work and support them in their efforts. And that's the work of Red, Wine, and Blue.
I'd like to thank my guest, Ellen Gaddy, for sharing her story with me today. If you have thoughts or comments about it, please leave them on our social channels, or better yet, leave a message on the Overlook line at 984-278-7301. We might just use your comments in an upcoming episode of The Overlook. Today's conversation happened inside the BB Theater in downtown Asheville, which owners Susan and Giles Collard have been so gracious enough to open to me to record my interviews. Our theme music for The Overlook, Maker's Song, comes courtesy of the Asheville band The Resonant Rogues. The Overlook is a production of Podcast Asheville. New episodes are online by 6 a.m. every weekday wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for our weekly newsletter at podavl.com. And please support the show by going to our Patreon page at patreon.com/The Overlook Podcast. I'm Matt Peiken, and I'll see you on the next episode of The Overlook.